right. Hello, Catholic YouTube. Brian with City of the Immaculata back with you. Joined today by Allan Ruhl. I'm sure Allan needs no introduction for the viewers of my channel. Allan is an inexhaustible wealth of knowledge and information. And today I've got a topic that I've been anticipating for some time to get him on the channel and discuss with. So Allan, thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
So you and I have been talking for, months now, I think, just kind of sharing thoughts and ideas back and forth on just the topic of Eastern Orthodoxy in general, but specifically for the conversation today, the demographic situation with the Eastern Orthodox. And I find that it's really difficult, even as somebody who's spent time with this subject for many years at this point, to kind of navigate between the information and the misinformation. And I found in recent months, especially, there's been a flood of misinformation. And I know you and I have shared quite a bit of thoughts about that. So, yeah, I mean, without further introduction, Allan, unless you got any introductory things that you would like to say, we'll just go ahead and jump into the presentation.
Let's start.
Right. So let me get this up for you guys. Share screen. All right, looks pretty good. So, hot topic, the future of Orthodox demographics. Now, the goals and intentions of this, I've tried to keep pretty concise and clear. I would say first and foremost, a very important thing to kind of get out of the way is that the intention, and I think I could probably speak for Allan here too, is not to celebrate the demise of Christian people, any Christian people, especially when you're dealing with the demographics of Christians who, in many of the instances that we're going to go through today, are quite ancient, these communities. And we could very well see the demise of many of them within our lifetime. So, I imagine you would agree with that, Allan. Like, this is not something that we as Catholics should be like hurrahing or cheering on.
No, we just want to bring the facts, because I mean, in America, there seems to be, a few converts, more converts than usual, and people want to know, is the global church growing? And keep in mind, America is kind of like if the entire global Orthodox Church was like a human body, the American church would be like a pinky.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean that just shows, but the rest of it is, demography is important, right? It's not just important for religion, though it is. It's important for a lot of things. I mean, if you need to be able to keep your historic populations,
mm-hmm.
And these like there seems to be a few extra converts in America, but I wonder if that's enough to stop the whole global trend, which is very much in the other direction. And let me spoil it for you, it's not.
Yeah, and that's why I think, there's a line, I think about this line when I'm thinking of this topic. There's a line in the movie Departed where Martin Sheen's character says to Leonardo DiCaprio that we deal in deception, we don't deal in self-deception. And I understand, Allan, to a degree, the whole idea of, you fake it till you make it and putting on a good face and a good show of things while you're not in the best position. But I wonder at times if some of the people that are presenting this narrative of the explosion of orthodoxy, if they're actually engaged in the fake it till you make it, or if they're have truly deceived themselves. And I think there's quite a large number that are convinced that they should have these numbers that aren't, in the grand scheme of things, kind of negligible, as you were just pointing out. Because you'd barely get, as far as historic Christianity goes, as far as modern Christianity goes, the United States isn't necessarily a good pulse for the global health of any kind of demographics, as we'll see here in a little bit. But I tried to make this a fairly exhaustive analysis, even in my, attempts to be concise. We're going to cover the Middle East. We're going to cover Asia Minor, Eastern Europe, the United States. All of these, I think, are pertinent to the discussion. As well, we're going to go through something that I'm calling the Orthodox dilemma that we will get to at the end. And then kind of just sum up with like what I think is a realistic purview of Orthodox demographics.
All right.
And so I'm just going to put this out there so that you guys can kind of see where this is coming from. Maybe some of you guys that follow the channel that aren't necessarily keeping up with these issues. This is first in response to a recent trend that I've seen where the mainstream media has picked up this narrative of, Orthodox churches are drawing in these far-right American converts, which is from NPR. Young men leaving traditional churches for masculine Orthodox Christianity in droves from the New York Post. So the mainstream media has picked up this narrative as well. You find online. And I'm not picking on any individual people here. I've saved these screenshots as just examples of a very, very recent but seemingly pervasive trend where the Orthodox have presented this as like this massive explosion in orthodoxy. You'll see in the bottom, I guess it would be the bottom right of the screen, there was this meme that was making the rounds about how orthodoxy in America was going from 700,000 to 6 million members in 4 years. And like, again, this is being presented not as like, hey guys, let's put on a good face. This is like people are sharing this to rebut Catholics.
Well, if you mind going back for a second. Yeah. It says you've got this one that's, I saw this a while back. Orthodoxy in America from 700 to 6 million members in 4 years. I even saw Jay Dyer retweet that.
Yeah, and I've actually got him up at the top left there too, but that's Jay's comment. Jay is like,
I thought that was Luigi. Oh,
no, that's Jay. Jay makes this like consistent claim about how the Orthodox are taking Catholics, and this is another reason why Allan and I like to discuss this, because they are clear in their intent that they are trying to pick from the Catholic ranks in our sheep. And he's always bringing up how they're winning converts in the thousands, right? The thousands is this number that he sort of blithely throws out as if, we can deduce anything important from that number. And that's actually the first thing that I wanted to really like present to you guys, because when you're dealing with these kinds of numbers, I have personally found, I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on this, but a lot of human beings have a hard time jumping mentally from, when you're talking about thousands versus talking about millions to a billion, right? Like we have a hard time grasping that. And if you just look up online, like just do a search of like illustrate the difference between a million and a billion, like you can see in some of these visual representations that you can just do in a quick Google search. When you go from a million to a billion, you're talking about a drastic, extremely non-comparable difference in the numbers. As you can see on the one that I have here, like 50K would just be a dot. A million would be like, if you had $1 million in cash, you could fit that in like a briefcase. You're not talking about a whole lot of money. No, when you're talking about $1 billion, you're talking about pallets of briefcases full of millions of dollars to get to that point.
1,000 million. When, in terms of numbers, I will say this from someone who all he does is read primary sources from ancient, medieval, and modern history. Numbers are one of the hardest things to determine. Mm-hmm. And it's not just, well, back then they didn't know anything. Well, today they do too. You could watch CNN. If there's like a pro-life march in Washington, D.C., Fox News will say there's 500,000 people. And, on NBC or whatever, they'll say there's like 75,000. There seems to be no consensus. people just throw out numbers. Like in World War II, the bombing of Dresden. What, do you know how many casualties happened during the bombing of Dresden at the end of World War II?
I've heard conflicting numbers for that for sure.
There are conflicting numbers. It's everywhere from 20,000 to over 200,000. Like that's a factor of 10. Um, Now I don't know what the real number is, but I mean to learn the real number, you would have to have data in, because I mean a lot of people were retreating as well. It's not just the civilians of Dresden. A lot of people were retreating and taking refuge in the city, and so there's bombings. And the thing is, and so the bombs happened, and so and then there's these wild conflicting numbers, and no one really has a uh knows what the numbers are. I'm happy to say we don't know, but 200,000 and 20,000, that's pretty, that's a wide range of possibilities.
Yeah, and
And
even just here, when you're jumping from the kind of numbers that we're going to talk about with Eastern Orthodox, comparable to the kind of numbers that you would find in something like the Roman Catholic Church, which we're not going to dive too deeply. We kind of decided just to keep that conversation as a separate conversation. But you're dealing with a drastic disparity of numbers that aren't even really comparable, because the Roman Church, even on the lower end of the numbers, like you're dealing with well over 1 billion people. I mean, it's just a fact, right? Whereas the Orthodox, as we're going to see, it's not quite so clear.
yeah,
And
and there's probably only, I think, 9 majority Eastern Orthodox countries. And you got to, and keep in mind, you got to be careful too when people say Orthodox. They like they tend to throw in Orientals as well,
mm-hmm.
like Ethiopians, Coptics, Armenians. So it's kind of hard to separate that. You know, you got to be careful. And
so Well, so if you just look at the one, it's got 30,000, 200,000, 1 million, and then they're starting to build 1 billion on the far right of that one graph of bricks. And then just to illustrate again, like I had to chop the image up. You can find it on Google, but you're dealing with like bricks that would be up in the stratosphere as well. Like just another, I think that kind of helps, another analogy that helps people put their minds around it. 1 million seconds ago was 12 days ago. 1 billion seconds ago was 32 years ago. 1 million minutes ago was about 2 years ago. 1 billion minutes ago was the year 114 AD. So you're not long after the death of the last apostle to go back 1 billion minutes, as opposed to merely 2 years of 1 million minutes. So that's just to kind of illustrate all of that. Was there anything? I'm sorry, I think I cut you off there, Alan.
well, yeah, no. Again, numbers have confused mankind since. Again, going back to the ancient sources, and modern historians will mock people like Herodotus for giving these huge exaggerations, but we give them too. You know, like for example, like how many people were killed in the Iraq War, the
Mm-hmm.
2003 Iraq War. It's everything from 1 or 200,000 to almost 1 million. Like,
Yeah.
the numbers are all over the place.
Look at the disparity. We're going to talk later about Ukraine and Russia, but we'll see some wide disparities in the numbers there as well.
Yeah.
Now, as far as the qualitative importance of demographics, I just have a few comps here. I mean, a few quotes here. Augustus Comte said that demography is destiny. I took a demography class as an undergrad, and it was, I think I had like a limited choice of electives, and I just picked it at random. And it actually turned out to be one of my favorite classes that I ever took as an undergrad. And it's mind opening when you sort of begin to apply what we see, even politically, not even just religiously, happening. And this is why I include as well Pat Buchanan in here, because Pat Buchanan has been sounding this alarm for decades at this point, right? Pat Buchanan says that the West is dying, its nations have ceased to reproduce, and their populations have stopped growing and begun to shrink. Not since the Black Death carried off 1/3 of Europe in the 14th century has there been a graver threat of survival of Western civilization. And yeah, Pat Buchanan has stacks of books that you could read going all the way back to the 80s about the demographic situation, which I feel like in many respects, Alan, like our generation is kind of living to see the fruits of what he was predicting all of those decades ago.
Well, yeah, and I mean, it's not a big deal. And do you ever read a book from like 2006 by Mark Stein called America Alone?
No, I hadn't read that one.
Okay, he talks a lot about the demographics of the Islamic world versus the West, the Islamic populations in Europe versus the indigenous populations, and all that stuff. And what there is the thing about like it's kind of interesting because it's kind of like, look, they have the advantage, but now you take a look in 2025, the demographics from the Islamic world are starting to plummet. I mean, it just took an extra generation. I mean, all you need is to get contraception in that culture, and it'll completely destroy your demographics. Like, I know that happened in Iran. Like in Iran, post revolution, like the Khomeini revolution, people were having big families, and then I think in 85 or 86, some people asked the Ayatollah, like their spiritual leader, they're like, hey, you know, in the West, they got something called birth control. You think we could use that here, you know? And then he thought about it, and he's like, I don't see why not. And then almost immediately, their demographics dropped below replacement, like in like 1 or 2 years. The birth rates in Iran are similar to those in the West. Same with UAE. Same with a lot of Islamic countries that used to have high birth rates. It just took an extra. Now, if you go to like rural Afghanistan, they still have like high birth rates, but no,
when I was taking that class, actually, that class was taught by a Chinese immigrant. And one of the things, this was back in the 2007 or 8 range. And she was saying, this was at this point almost 20 years ago, she was saying to expect a demographic collapse in China. And back then, even 20 years ago, just back in 2007 and 8, that was like unheard of. People would laugh when I would bring that up to them. And now here 20 years later, like nobody's laughing at that. Like I think it's a given at this point that China is on the they're not even on the precipice. They have kind of passed that kind of point of no return where there's not enough. Now the Chinese, it was all due to like social engineering and things like that. It wasn't a natural occurrence for them. But no, to your point, like this was actually the next thing you anticipated, Alan, where I was going with it. When we're looking at the world's population, there's so many challenges to studying demographics, quad demographics, let alone just religious demographics. And this is one of the things that these groups that I see online, these groups of, I don't even know what to categorize them as, Alan. I guess the people call them the Ortho Bros, but I don't particularly like that. But this group of Orthodox online, they keep saying, well, you know, all the information that you have is from 2010. And, you know, we're going to go into a little bit later of why that's not necessarily a good rebuttal. But when you're dealing with,
but the thing is, I've shown them. But the thing is, I've shown them stats from like, yeah, they'll say that, oh, that's from 2010, that's from 2016, and then you show them stuff from 2024, and then they block you. So,
well, and then it's also like we're all dealing with, like, when you do demographics, you're largely concerned with to get funding for demographics. Most of the people that are going to pay for that are concerned with future projections. They're not so much concerned with like a snapshot of the moment right now. So yeah, when you're dealing with demographics analysis that was done in 2012 or whatever, they're trying to project forward into the future, 10, 15, 20, 50 years into the future, which is admittedly a challenging thing to do, but we're all drawing from the same methodologies, from the same resources. And I mean, so I guess just to kind of get it out of the way, one of the challenges for any of us is when you see these kind of like statistics about, I included a picture here where there's, let's see, they project, I think 2050, 1.5 billion Catholics, 1 billion charismatics, 800 million Protestants, all the way down to 300 million Orthodox. Like, they don't include in these questionnaires a lot of the time, how are you identifying a Catholic, right? Are you just going into a baptismal registry and seeing how many baptisms there were in a given year? Well, Allan, you know as well as I do, that's not a good measure for the
Well,
health of the Catholic Church.
well, like if you take a look at stats from Turkey, what percent of Turkey is Islamic?
Mhm.
And keep in mind, Turkey is a very westernized Islamic country. They say it's 99% Islamic. And the only reason they say that is because when you register the birth certificate, if you have two ethnically Turkish parents, they stamp Islam as your religion. And your ID card in Turkey will say religion, and then say it. And you can't do anything about that. It's just like part of the birth. And I know this dates back, because the modern day Republic of Turkey inherited this from the Ottoman millet system, where, like, if you're, like, say, a Greek or an Armenian or a Jew in the Ottoman Empire, you're registered within your millet. So if you want to get divorced, you don't go to a court. You go to, like, the people in charge of your community, and they'll grant you the divorce. It's not like there's a courthouse anywhere. So like the Jews would go to their Beit Din or something like that. And it makes sense, like they started this in the 1300s. Like it made sense back then, because about 99% of people cared about religion back then, right? Whereas the numbers are a lot different today, so it's kind of an outdated system. But yeah, no, like it's kind of like a baptismal registry. It's kind of like, okay, their parents thought enough to get them baptized. But
Yeah, I
have
mean,
they
that's one of
raised
the
them?
issues. That's one of the issues that Brazil had. Like, I mean, I had a very, very good conversation with she works with the Olavo de Carvalho, I guess you could call it, foundation at this point, translating all of his works into English. But I asked her the very question. I said, like, what happened with the demographic collapse in Brazil? And she said, it's not that there was the Catholic demographic collapse in Brazil. And she said, it's not that there was necessarily a demographic collapse where Catholics left the church. It's that all they ever measured in Brazil to identify Catholics was how many baptisms were taking place. It was never the actual, like, a health study of, like, how often do they attend mass? How seriously do they take holy day? Like the kind of things that we would actually consider important in measuring.
Yeah,
The
like for example, if you go to France today, France is known as a more secular Catholic country. Still, I heard about 86% of ethnic French people, like not including immigrants, are baptized in the Catholic Church. And so, like, most ethnic French are still baptized. But I mean, what percentage of those people actually practice their faith? It's less than 86%. I can tell you that much.
And so also when we're looking at religious demographics, one of the challenges for making future projections that we're all faced with is just shifting political landscapes. Like, nobody over a decade ago would have predicted the Ukraine war, where we have upwards of 1 million dead. The Middle East instability that has, like, wreaked havoc on Christians, as we will see. And then, as Allan was pointing out earlier, just the kind of uncertainty of modernity and what modernity is doing to things like fecundity and the overall global trend, which a lot of people watching this, a lot of people don't realize. We always hear about the population explosion, the population explosion. Well, that's been like demographers have seen this coming for a long time. That's been tapering off for a while, and it's not projected to continue exponentially. In fact, we're very likely, as Allan was pointing out, on the verge of something of a worldwide demographic collapse.
Yeah, like pretty much like you've got kind of like Central Asia, like Afghanistan, Pakistan, parts of India. They still have a solid birth rate, and then Africa. But pretty
Mm-hmm.
much everywhere else is like replacement or below. Like South America is, I think, just floating around at replacement. So is the Middle East. Western Europe and North America are well below. Australia is well below. China is well below. As you pointed out, that's kind of self-inflicted with China. And like a couple countries are starting to realize this and are trying to give incentives
Mm-hmm.
to get the birth rates back up. Like I know Hungary was trying something like that. They started to do this about 10 years ago, and they actually had some success until COVID came, and then it kind of reset. But then but no, like apart from Africa, there's not much above replacement demographics in the world.
And even Africa, you're dealing largely with the sub-Saharan Africa, which is sort of like
Yeah, that's true.
limited in scope to that area. So with I guess that's as far as I have, as far as preliminary introduction to the topic. Allan, was there anything you wanted to add before we dive into the individual Orthodox nations and countries and
No,
people?
I think we've covered most of it. We can move on.
So, just to begin with the Middle East, I did want to just recommend a book for those of you guys who may be interested in going a little bit deeper into the long history of the decline of Eastern Christianity in the Middle East. This is not, now, granted, it's kind of in the last 20 years, 30 years or so, hit something of a hyperspeed. This is not a recent development. Bat Ye'or wrote a book, I think this is from the 70s or 80s. She was. Instrumental in defining this concept of demitude and the sort of plight of Christians in the East. Now, granted, Bat Ye'or is, she's a little bit of she has a strong bias for Israel over the Middle East. So she's going to she's going to try to make the Islamic world look as awful as possible. But there's quite a bit of truth to the presentation, and I think at this point most historians accept and acknowledge the reality of the what is it, the plural, the demi status of Christians in Islam.
Yeah. So, and what that is if what would happen in the 7th century and after that, but mainly in the 7th century, you have the Islamic Empire conquering Christian lands, and they basically offer them two choices. One, they can convert to Islam, or two, they can keep their Christian faith or their Jewish faith. There's Jews in these lands too, but you're in a separate class. And well, in the 21st century, it's easy to pick on this. A lot of people are going to be mad at me for saying this. I don't think religious rights of religious minorities were much better anywhere else. Like if you were a Jew in Europe, it's not like you had a great status as well. So
It's arguably it was quite stable. It was quite stable for Christians in the Middle East, I would say.
Yeah. Well,
At least up until World War II, anyways.
Well, yeah, but keep in mind, by World War II, it's post-Islamic. I think it's unfair to call that Islamic. Because like when we talk about the mass persecution, I don't want to use the G word, of Armenians in Anatolia in World War I. That was not primarily done by Islamists. That was done by nationalists.
Yeah.
There were Muslims involved. I'm not going to say that there were no Muslims involved, but the point is the Armenians had lived there for hundreds of years as second-class citizens. I'll concede that, but I guess the final point we want to make about this is that it's hard for your population to thrive in this second-class citizenship because you have to pay a tax. Now, I don't think there's a fixed rate on this tax, but depending on where you were at what time, it could be not that bad, or it could be pure extortion, or anything in between, really. And so these communities are kind of like in perpetual poverty, because they got to give a lot of money to the empire, whereas like, for example, if you go to the Ottoman Empire, that was a very successful empire at one point. And like about half their population was non-Islamic. They had Greek Christians, Armenian Christians, some Jews, paying the jizya as dhimmis. But that gave their government a lot of cash. Whereas if there's an Islamic empire that's almost completely Islamic, it's very unsuccessful. I tend to notice that.
Yeah, and there seems to be with the, I mean, clearly if you read Bat Yeor's book, she says that this is the inevitable trend that things were heading specifically because of the dhimmi status. Though I do kind of wonder if it's maybe, there's other factors to consider where, even just in general, as you were pointing out, Alan, to be a religious minority in a community that sustains itself for centuries and centuries, it's not an easy task to do. And you're only ever one or two, maybe three generations away from having what little demographics you're able to eke out and maintain through the generations from losing that, like in any given thing can come along and sort of do a lot of damage and harm to that, which is exactly what we find happening, especially since the 1990s and 2000s, with the region that just generally people call the Levant, which would be Jordan. Well, go ahead.
Well, and let me give you an example. You have, the country of Egypt, which it's not Eastern, but it's Oriental Orthodox. They were conquered in the 7th century, and they got the second class status. For several centuries they had it, and they were all right. But in the 14th century, there was a couple rulers in a row of Egypt who were just like fanatics. They didn't care about respecting the rights that were given to them in Islamic law. And so in the 14th century, the Coptics were persecuted en masse. Now, they survived as a community, but their numbers were quickly. And of course, the people that took over after, it's like, sorry, those guys are not Islamic. We'll give you your rights back. But the damage has done. Their community's already in very steep decline after that.
So, well, as far as the Levant goes, I would generally include, so you've got Syria, Lebanon, Jordan. I would typically include Iraq as part of the Levant, as part of the wider Levant. You see, for example, with the rise of ISIS or ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, they themselves see themselves as part of a wider population of people. And really, as Alan was pointing out earlier, technically, these things really began with World War I, when after the Allies won World War I, the British came in and carved up the Middle East in ways that, in hindsight, are kind of insane. I oftentimes think that the British were intentional in their choices, because the demographics of the communities of the quote unquote countries that they built don't necessarily add up, and it's a bit of a nightmare for, say, the United States of America to come in and invade a country like Iraq and then do something like hold open I'm sorry to get political with this, but it's like hold open elections in a country like Iraq, thinking that you're going to have some kind of peaceful transition of power, when you pretty much just handed the country over to the Shia population, which is its own separate demographic and subject, which in turn has just added to the further instability and conflict of the region. Which brings me to
Yeah,
the first. Okay, go for it.
And the thing is, like, you talk about Iraq, that's a country where the Christian population was doing all right prior to America.
Yeah.
Like, I hate Western intervention in these countries because they have done nothing but devastated the local Christian population. Like, this is both American wars and Zionism. The Israelis have done horrible things to both and to the Islamic population too.
Mm-hmm.
They've ethnically cleansed a lot of these people. They've displaced them. Whereas, like, we're about to take a look at Iraq. You have 1.5 million Christians prior to the war, and now they've lost over 1 million. Like, a lot of them have moved out. In fact, probably most of them have moved to the West. But I see those people as the religious hope of Iraq, and I think our new pontiff has recently said he encourages the Christian families of those areas to stay.
Yeah, I mean, and it's such a diverse community there. Like Iraq is unique in that, we're largely focused on the Orthodox here, but you have a diverse Christian community in Iraq, Chaldean. The Assyrian Church of the East is there, large population of Syriac Orthodox. And some of those communities, Alan, I'm sure as you're aware, like they go back to the very early centuries of the church. Like I'm talking continuous communities of intergenerational families that in our lifetime are no longer in these areas. Like that's a tragedy.
Yeah, well, and like for example, once I talked to a guy who was half Turkish, half Iraqi, half Turk, half Iraqi, and like he's showing me pictures on his phone of his trip to Dubai. He's going through his pictures, and then I see a word in Turkish, Nisan, and I'm like, oh, is that April? And he's like, yeah. How did you know? I said, well, it's the same in Hebrew. I've studied a bit of Hebrew. And he's like, oh, are you Jewish? And I'm like, no, I'm Catholic. And he's like, oh, you know that in Iraq we have like the oldest Christian community. They they speak the language of Jesus. They go back to Jesus. Like he's bragging to me that like they got the oldest Christian communities in the world, but like unfortunately in the last 20 years these communities have been in a massive state of decline, mainly. Well, like I think, believe it or not, that Saddam Hussein was actually pretty good to the Christian population.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, it was one of the worst
Like,
things we did to the Christians was ousting him.
yeah, and it completely destabilized the region. And you get local Shia warlords vying for power, and there's actually a good book about this. It's called, I can't remember what it's called. It's by a guy named Joseph Fidel, who was a Shia Muslim in Iraq who converted to Catholicism. And it's kind of interesting because you get to see how that country works. Like Saddam kept the Sunnis in power. Like, if you wanted a government job under Saddam, you had to be a Sunni, although they were only like 30 to 40% of the population. Like in Iraq, there's a lot of Shia holy sites, and there's a lot of religious fanaticism among the Shia. I'm not saying all of them, but and so just to be safe, he kept them out of all positions of power. So if you were wanted to be a judge on a court, you had to be a Sunni, right? And so there was kind of this. I mean, I wouldn't say apartheid, but discrimination against Shias and
Yeah, and I think it was more. I
they,
mean, I think for Saddam specifically, it was more utilitarian than anything. He was just. I mean, he was in the Iraq, where it's located, is an extreme, as we've come to learn, an extremely unstable area. So for him to have to use an iron fist to sort of maintain stability for the people of that region, now in hindsight, you can very much justify, because I mean, as this BBC article here, the headlines from 2019, Iraq's Christians close to extinction, and that hasn't gotten any better in the intervening 6 years since this article come out. Very much related to Iraq is the situation in Syria, because when we lost Saddam Hussein as sort of that bulwark against the wider Persia, maybe you could think of it as, for those of you historian buffs out there, the Sunni response to that was, of course, going to come in the form of violence and insurrection, as we saw with the Syrian civil war that came in the wake of the Iraq war. And as far as the Christian population goes, it's again, as Allan was pointing out at the beginning, determining these numbers is very difficult, because whenever you're trying to send demographers, for example, into a war-torn region to get the pulse on a community, the political leaders of the area aren't necessarily concerned with some of those things. They're dealing with issues that are very much prevalent. But from all that we can tell, the civil war in Syria has been an absolute catastrophe. And in this particular situation, you would be dealing with a predominant Orthodox community. The Patriarch of Antioch is in Syria, for example.
Yeah, well, and keep in mind, like a lot of these, you've got both Eastern and Oriental. So when we say Orthodox, in fact, I think in Egypt and in Israel and in Syria, like the two Orthodox churches, both Eastern and Oriental, are pretty much almost in communion with each other. You can go to each other's. You bring this up to the Ortho Bros. They because
they lose their minds over it.
Yeah. They're like obsessed with being anti-ecumenist, right? And of course, I'm against ecumenism, but I mean, it becomes fanatical at some point, especially amongst the Jordanville crowd. But if you go to those countries, a lot of both Eastern and Oriental are an intercommunion almost. Like they're allowed to get communion from either church. The Catholics aren't part of this arrangement, by the way. The Catholics are on their own. But
well, I know as far as like the Melkite Church goes, I have heard, and I've heard this from more than one source, that there is, at least in the Levant, there's intercommunion that takes place with the at least the bishops are aware that it's taking place. They don't explicitly give permission, but they know that there are certain Melkite priests who will commune Orthodox and certain Orthodox priests who will commune Melkites. And I think that's been going on actually for quite a while. But
maybe, yeah.
Maybe for the church in Syria, though, it says here, that you've got as low as 300,000 Christians left in Syria today. And as well, Allan, I don't know, I don't keep up with the news, the current events as much as I used to, but I have heard rumors and rumblings that seem to be pretty reliable that with the recent ousting of Assad, the persecutions against Christians has revamped and restarted, that we were seeing about 15 years ago with the rise of ISIS, where they were martyring Christians. And I think ISIS learned its lesson. Where they're not necessarily blasting it all over social media. They realized that was a bad PR move. And so my understanding is that the persecutions that you may be seeing, the persecutions that may be taking place in Syria right now today, aren't going to be making headlines. And I mean, there's a lot of politics involved in that too. For one, the West has to somewhat justify its stance towards the ousting of Assad since he was a ally of Putin. So we kind of have to be like, hoorah, yay for that. But meanwhile, like, don't pay attention to the fact that Assad was actually, much like Saddam, protecting his Christian population. So
Well,
yeah.
the thing about Assad, the thing that's interesting about this that really confuses me, there's about two main positions about the Middle East. One is against Zionism and against American intervention. One is pro-Zionist, pro-American intervention. Now, with the whole jousting of Assad, it's interesting because there's people in both camps that are really happy. So it's really confused me because those two camps, on almost every issue, they're on the opposite side.
Mhm.
But in this case, there's a ton of anti-Zionists who are like, oh, I love the fact that Assad's gone. It's like, okay, but there's a lot of pro-Zionists who's happy he's gone. That's kind of obvious, right? I mean,
Yeah.
since the Israelis are occupying Syrian land in the Golan, and they've since taken more land, they've gone beyond the purple line. That's what it like. You got the green line for the West Bank, but it's called the purple line for the Golan. And so, yeah, I don't know what to make of it, but based on everything I've heard, it's not good for the Christian population. I know their numbers have been dwindling for 20 years, but now it's
that's
it's
going
even
to be
worse.
kind of the common theme, I think, that you'll see here. I mean, I've included Lebanon as well. Lebanon is an interesting one because they were a Christian majority country in the Middle East at one time, which is, as many of you would be aware, a rare thing indeed. But they've tipped that balance. Let me see.
Well,
Unofficial statistics. Go ahead.
in the case of Lebanon, it's kind of interesting because it kind of happened the same way demographics happen globally. Like if you go back to the 70s, the Christian birth rate plummeted, where the Islamic birth rate stayed high. Now the Islamic birth rate has plummeted as well, again because of contraception. You can turn your excuse my language here, but turn your wife's body into a masturbation tool without the responsibility because of contraception. And because of that, there's it's essentially the Islamic population had an extra generation
Mm-hmm.
of high birth rates, and now they're both low. They're both floating around replacement level. Last I
Yeah, and I
checked.
mean, the poor Lebanese, they're just kind of caught between these conflicts that they're basically surrounded by countries that are in perpetual state of strife at this point. So, even if you wanted to have a stable, healthy demographic population, as this headline here says, they're sort of caught between a rock and a hard place where they're trying to resist displacement. As we had mentioned, some of these numbers are due to displacement, but we don't ever want to see as far as a worldwide population goes, that may not decrease the worldwide population numbers, but we never really want to see people leave their ancient historic lands if they don't have to. Usually when people are displaced, it's for very bad reasons. They end up being refugees in countries where when they go there, they a lot of the times, Alan, as you mentioned with just the general secular trend, they end up just absorbing into the general population and they lose their identity, which is not what we would want to see.
Yeah, like for example, I'm friends with an apologist online named Elijah Yassi. I've collabed with him. Um, and of course, he's a Catholic from Iraq. His wife's an Iraqi Catholic as well. But they don't go to the Chaldean church. They attend the Latin Mass. which I'm happy they still have faith. Don't get me wrong, but I mean, like, there's a good chance. I I don't know. I'm kind of with the Pope on this one. Like the Christians of those countries need to stay there, but I
Yeah.
mean, at the same time, it it's dangerous, right?
I had there was a lady at my old parish, and we were at a dinner one time, and I'd seen her at the parish many times. I just never talked to her. But when we were talking, she was like, "Oh, well, I used to attend, the parish was called St. Anthony's." And I was like, "Oh, yeah, that's a Marionite parish." And she was like, "Yeah." And so I was like, "Oh, so you must be Lebanese." And she was like, "Yeah, no one's ever known that before." But then I was like, "Well, why did you leave St. Anthony's?" And she was telling me that she came over to our Latin Catholic church because, in her words, it was less ethnic. And this would be a sidebar for, having a conversation, about the ethnic dilemma with certain Orthodox churches, though that's been sort of a Christian problem as well. I think many Catholics are just unaware of their own history. But I understand her concern, and just not wanting to be this isolated community in a sea of like Latin Catholicism, her being here in the United States. At the same time, I totally understand this Maronite community wanting to preserve and maintain and keep its identity in a sea of, even just removing it from the Catholic situation, in a sea of American secularism, right? Like just trying to maintain your identity. Yeah, you're going to be a little standoffish. There's going to be like boundaries and norms and things like that you're going to want to. Now, the challenge to that is if you're, as we pointed out, if you maintain yourself as a religious minority in a community, that's like the overwhelming population is not part of your community, you're going to struggle in many senses. And you're only, she clearly, I'm not judging her, but she clearly has removed herself and her family from that Maronite community. And it's very good chance that her children won't return back to it, and her children will just be absorbed into the wider Latin community, which, I'm not comfortable with that personally. I'd like to see our
Well,
identities maintained.
and I think the 21st century is seeing the end of ethno religions, not just ethno churches, but ethno religions in total.
Hmm.
Like certainly in Islam, the only type of Islam that's growing is Sunni, and that's the generic one. Like if you go to Iran, although they do have a theocracy there, the population's very secularized because it's kind of
Mhm.
like a tribal religion. The Shias of Iraq, the Alawites, that group in Turkey, what are they? Alevis, like they're highly secularized. Um, and like you take a look in Christianity, like you got the like I'll show three denominations. You have the Russian Orthodox Church, which is very is it's got a lot of formal members, but you got the Church of Armenia and say the Church of England. Those are three different denominations, um, and they're not doing well in this world. Whereas the Catholic Church is doing a lot better because it didn't fall into the whole ethno trap.
Mhm.
I nationalism um, kind of gave some of these churches a break because they were promoted as being part of, but now that nationalism has cooled off,
Mhm.
uh, it's yeah. So like it like I think the 21st century will see the end of ethno religions in total, not
Mhm.
just I think I think Catholicism, I think evangelicalism, since neither's tied to an ethnicity apart from the small Eastern rites, will and Sunni Islam will do a lot better than the tribal religions of
Yeah, it would be something to have you back on, Alan. Maybe if I can kind of gather some notes for the wider Roman Catholic demographic outlook in the future. I heard someone say recently, which I hadn't considered, but I think there's some truth to it. if you are truly interested in the future of the Roman Catholic Church, then we're basically going to be you're you're dealing with two demographics. You're dealing with the traditionalist demographic and you're dealing with the charismatic demographic. And those two, for the Roman Church to move forward in the future, are going to have to find a way to kind of come together and agree in agreement, right? Because as far as like who's having babies and who's maintaining their numbers for the foreseeable future, but that would be like a totally different to go into the Roman Catholic thing. But
Yeah, that's a whole new rabbit hole.
Finishing up here with the Levant, just some things to keep an eye on. Trump threw out recently some very stark numbers about the 1.5 million left in Gaza, which is a significant drop since the eruption of conflict there, which would mean that all of these translate to whether we're dealing about who Israel may want to go after next, the loss of Assad, possible war with Iran. All of this is going to translate to bad things for Christians and Orthodox Christians, especially.
Well, and keep in mind that what's going on with the Israelis, they're losing a lot of support in the West, because like the Israelis have not been good for the Christian populations of the region. That's for sure.
Yeah. Now they do have
and
interesting here, Alan, just to kind of move it over to Israel. That's the one spot that I could find in the Middle East where you see an uptick in the Christian numbers, but it's directly related to the Orthodox situation. It's actually not the Orthodox Israelis that are increasing in numbers that I could find. It's actually the Melkite Greek Catholics that have had a recent uptick in their numbers in Israel. So as far
yeah,
as
like
who is demographically in the majority in Israel, it's not going to be the Greek Orthodox.
yeah, no, that's true. Like the Catholics amongst the Arab populations, like I think most Christians in Israel are in the north, places like Haifa, where there's a lot less fanaticism. It's not like the West Bank where you have these fanatic settlers who burn like the crops of the Palestinians and stuff. But it's there's a lot less fanaticism, a lot less stable population. A stat that's not being thrown around, you have to search for this, but there's a lot of Israelis have left Israel since the war. Like about the sources I have put it at about 500,000 Israelis, and these are probably more like the coastal, more liberal type of Israelis, ones who probably believe in a two-state solution. They're leaving. And of course, the settlements in the West Bank, sometimes called Judea and Samaria, those people have really high birth rates and they're super fanatical. And
I actually
like,
included that because as I'm looking around worldwide demographics, it's hard to find what looks like a healthy what we call a pyramid in demography, right? Like a healthy birth rate, which is where I included it here. This is not Christian. This is just the Israeli population as a whole. But I have my qualms with Israel as a nation state. But as far as whatever they're doing for their demographics at the moment, as of 2023, when they did this, this is what a healthy, and I included it here as a reference because that's what a healthy demographic looks like. You want to have at the bottom more children than deaths, right? And many of the demographics that we're going to be looking at moving forward is going to be the inverse of that.
Well, if you take a look at Israel, though, I think one of the reasons, not all, but one of the reasons is financial. Because those settlers in the West Bank have subsidized housing. Their mortgage is very small compared to Tel Aviv, which is apparently to live in Tel Aviv is like living in New York. Like if you want a 2-bedroom flat, you're looking at in like a good area, you're looking at a ridiculous price. Whereas if you move to the West Bank, you're paying, and that's why if you take a look at the birth rates in the West Bank versus the birth rates in Tel Aviv or the coastal areas. There's a big difference. Like Tel Aviv's got like a Western birth rate, whereas if you go to the West Bank, it's like 4 or 5 kids per family.
Mm-hmm.
It is insane. And a lot of it is, one, these people are very religious people, so they believe in having big families. But two, it's because the homes are subsidized. They paid pennies on the dollar for a mortgage of a house, the equivalent of which they couldn't dream to afford in Tel Aviv.
So maybe that's just a lesson to learn, right? Like, even if we don't necessarily agree with the governments,
Right.
I especially don't agree with their geopolitics. You can maybe take a lesson in terms of, yeah. I mean, I would have a lot to say about the subsidizing of, especially religious, especially Catholic
And it
families.
comes from your government, the
Yep.
Israeli subsidies.
So moving over to Asia Minor, with Turkey, this is one that just actually yesterday kind of blew up on my Twitter, because there's these images of Pope Leo XIV meeting with his ecumenical, the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew. And look, all due respect to the ecumenical patriarch, with all due respect to the grave situation that he's facing, I understand. The challenges, and I understand why he would be making overtures towards Rome. And look, Alan, I would love to see the ecumenical patriarch back into communion with the Roman pontiff. Like, I would love to live to see that day, when those two are able to commune with one another. But as far as demographics go, as far as the demographic situation goes, and this kind of, again, blew up on my Twitter, Turkey's not a good situation at all for the Eastern Orthodox, especially
Nope.
the great city of Constantinople, which you see this all the time, Alan, on social media. The Orthodox talk about how the Hagia Sophia will be a church again. And this is, again, Alan, where, like, I'm wondering, do these people, are they so self-unaware? Are they so unaware of the situation of their churches, that they truly believe this? I tend to think they actually believe that you're going to see this, because they are experiencing maybe here this, like, uptick in numbers in the United States. They seem to think that this is like a worldwide thing, where the reality is in Turkey is pretty dire for Christians, especially the Orthodox. The Roman Catholic Church, this is the numbers that I was able to crunch. I did this myself based on the state government website of the religious demographics in Turkey. Now, that should be, for the green, that should be Sunni and Shia. I meant to hyphenate that and add Shia, but for all intents and purposes, they're not Orthodox, which is what we're trying to get at here. But that green is the Sunni Shia, taking into consideration, as Alan was pointing out earlier, how they actually count their religious communities.
Yeah.
It's still fairly negligible as far as the Orthodox are concerned, when within especially the city of Constantinople, the Greek Orthodox are looking at about around the higher estimates I've seen are about 3,000 people.
Yeah, and I heard an Orthodox priest. I quite like to listen to his stuff. He's very intelligent, Father John Whiteford.
Mm-hmm.
Like, keep in mind, in terms of cities, Istanbul is a very secular city, and that secularism is not with the Muslims there only; it's with the Christians as well. And with the amount of practicing Orthodox Christians in Istanbul, it's about 200 to 300. Like, we got the 3,000 as the, all right, you've been baptized as a kid. But
yeah, I've heard as few as, and this could be hyperbole. I don't think it's fully hyperbolic, but I've heard that it's mainly like a handful of little old ladies that attend the Divine Liturgy with the Ecumenical Patriarch every Sunday, and that's about all he's got for his see.
Interesting. Well, in all fairness, that's not the only Orthodox church in Istanbul. There's a few others,
yeah.
But and I guess people would.
It's still, I think, representative of just the reality of the situation for these people, where and this is one of the tragedies for me, Alan, is that this is why I didn't mention it, but I included back one of the earlier slides. the line from the T.S. Eliot poem where he said, "This is how the world ends. It ends with a whimper, not with a bang," because so much of this stuff happens like so quietly. Like if there's a persecution taking place of Syrian Christians in the Middle East and we don't see it, and meanwhile, like we're over here, I'm saying we loosely, I'm mainly speaking about the Ortho Bros. And in many respects, what it looks like to me, Allan, is you've got a group of people that are dancing on the deck of the Titanic. Like they see some little thing happening in their corner of the Titanic. They don't see the other end of the ship that's like floundering and sinking and going under the water. And like maybe I'm just an empathetic person, right? Like I see the plight of Christians in these communities, and I want to. If it were me, I would want to bring attention to these facts. I would want to bring attention to the fact that the Greek Orthodox are nearly on the verge of extinction in the ancient city of Constantinople.
And it used to be a Greek city too, right? That's kind of depressing. I'm going to actually
there's more Russian Orthodox in the city than there are Greek Orthodox.
Are there?
Significantly more. There are 15,000 Russian Orthodox in Constantinople, which, by the way, I have it here as Turkey. I should have mentioned this is specifically looking at Istanbul, this graph.
Well, then, like Russians, when they tend to leave their country, like their already low church rate gets even lower. But I'm curious, because of the current Russian Constantinople split, do they attend church at the Greek churches in Istanbul?
I heard so this has been a while ago. I've been engaged in these conversations for a little while. There was a Hira monk from New Zealand who many of you that maybe spent time on the Facebook forums, Russian Orthodox monk, and he was very vocal in a lot of the old Facebook forums. God willing, he's still alive.
I'm curious, is this Father Ramsey?
Father Ambrose.
Okay.
Ambrose Manoy, I think he was Irish by ethnicity.
Yeah, some name. Yeah.
He was up in the age many years ago. So anyways, he was predicting back then, this is before I had a relatively stronger grasp on what the situation was, that within at least our lifetimes, as in like mine and your age, that we would probably see a Russian ascend to the seat of the ecumenical patriarch in Constantinople, for the simple fact that they just demographically outnumber them so much. And I kind of remembered like chuckle because Father Ambrose would say outlandish things like that. Now I think they would probably, well, I don't know, Allan, I think I heard a rumor that the ecumenical patriarch by Turkish law must be from the city. I think that was something that I heard. Ethnically, I don't know though.
Citizen of Turkey.
Yeah. So maybe
he's got to be a citizen of the Republic of Turkey.
So maybe he would be, in theory, you could have a Russian that was born in Turkey. That if they're truly out, if they're truly wiped out in that sense. Which, when you're dealing with only 2,500 to 3,000 people, it's not a far-fetched thing to imagine there not being any more.
I've heard. Now this could change. I've heard they've also said that they would give. Now I don't know if this is for sure, but they would give citizenship to whoever the Greek Church wants to be the patriarch. So if there's a guy from Mount Athos they want to be the patriarch, the Turkish government will give them citizenship. The point is, Christianity there is all but deceased. It's all but dead. Yeah. Sadly.
And so this goes back to a post that I did on X several months back. This was kind of the impetus for my joining this conversation. This was one that kind of went viral. But anyways, yeah, this is just, reiterating what we're talking about. In Constantinople a century ago had 1.4 million Eastern Orthodox in the city. As late as 55, they had only 65,000. And then today the community is down to anywhere from, I've seen 1,500 up to about 3,000. So even if you give them even if you're generous and give them the 3,000, you're still dealing with what's, as far as demography is concerned, extinction levels of a community. Yeah. And, hopefully the ecumenical patriarch, I would hate to see him join communion with Rome only to have the Turkish government therefore then turn their bayonets on the community there. Because they are, as far as the Armenians go, they have shown themselves more than willing to displace a population. So,
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, that's true. I know there's Catholics in Turkey, but they're like converts and expats, and there's not a huge amount of them. There's very few Christians in Turkey.
all right, so moving over to Eastern Europe. As far as Eastern Europe goes, you can, and many of these, in many of these countries in Eastern Europe, the working assumption, and we're going to go into some of the specifics of them, is you're dealing with what were at one time the predominant Eastern Orthodox countries. Now, Eastern Europe as a whole, if you see this chart here, at the bottom of the chart, it goes from 1990 all the way up to 2024, and you can see there's been a steady decrease of the just as like raw numbers of the population goes, as well as the median age has continually increased. Where in 1990 the median age was 32, now it's 41. The fertility rates in Eastern Europe were already down below replacement levels in 1990. And they are now up down to rather 1.4 children per female, which is well below replacement levels. Starting to look at them sort of individually here, looking at some of the depopulation hotspots, and I've been using this website draws from several different sources here. It's drawing from the United Nations. But you could see, for example, like Romania. Romania is a fairly diverse country as far as its population goes, but they've got a negative 30% projected decrease in their overall. This is not just looking at Orthodox numbers, by the way. This is like just the general population decline of these countries. Bosnia down significantly low. Bulgaria, a very historically Orthodox country, down 30. Projected to be a 39% decrease by 2050. So overall, there's nowhere in the Balkans that are looking particularly good, with the exception of Austria and Slovenia to a small extent. Now, Balkans has been, when we're dealing with Eastern Europe, as many of you viewers would be aware, you're dealing with the countries that were basically like hammered into the ground for the last century under the Soviet occupation. The Balkans was all but a made-up country, Yugoslavia, under Soviet rule. And when it disintegrated, I remember in the late 1990s, I was, fairly young, but I lived in a pretty cosmopolitan area of Virginia, and we had an influx of refugees from the Bosnian War, the civil war that had taken place in the late 1990s. And they've just been, between war and the just instability that the Soviet Union economic system, political system, social system just wrecked on these countries. These countries just overwhelmingly are facing massive, probably the worst that we're going to see in these on a just natural level. I mean, at least Syria and the Levant and places like that, have war as an excuse. This is kind of that T.S. Eliot, these countries are just kind of fading away with a whimper. I mean, look at this trend in Serbia.
Well, these countries have had war as well in the 90s.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, plus the First World War. This was where the First World War began.
Yeah.
Archduke Francis Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo.
Very true.
And and there was fighting there in World War II. And so they certainly had war themselves. And of course, war just wipes out. The unfortunate thing about war is not only does it wipe out your population, but it wipes out your youth.
Yeah.
Like it's not 30 and 40-year-olds who are on the front lines putting their life on the line, right? It's people in their teens and their low 20s, right? Who are charging the enemy, getting shot. Like it's not the old people that get killed off. The old people are fine in war for the most part. They might get killed in a bombing raid or something, but what's
Yeah, and
going
we're also not seeing with the. It's not like where the American soldiers, the doughboys come back after World War I, or the soldiers come back after World War II, and there's a baby boom because they're returning home to their families. Like these people have nowhere to return home to. They're returning home to their like war decimated countries and their cities, and it's like a general malaise and apathy and nihilism seems to set in the wake of these. Political instability that takes place in the aftermath of a war. So yeah, you're absolutely right there, Alan, to point out, Serbia, especially in these other places. I was thinking more in the last like 10, 20 years, they haven't had the excuse of war. But as far as these long-term trends, like this trend is going all the way back to, you could see they had a peak in just before 1990, but it's been steady decline, which you could still trace. I mean, as far as there was a major shift right around the time that the war broke out in Serbia there. So, but look how, I mean, like that is not what you want to see when you're looking at a demographic trend for a country. That kind of steep arc, that inverse arc. Romania, not quite as exaggerated, but still one of the reasons, is this the one? Yeah. So you're going to see here, rampant immigration, aging population. It's taking their tolls on Romania. Bulgaria. Okay, this is one of the things I wanted to point out. So this is Bulgaria, and for those of you history buffs out there, you would know that Bulgaria has long been a. It's a little bit of that. I mean, much of Eastern Europe is sort of that that shift between the East and the West kind of takes place in some of these countries, and Bulgaria was, at one time disputed territory between Catholics and Orthodox, though it ended up going towards the Orthodox. But if you look here
well.
with, go for it, Alan.
Well, I could shed some history on that because I like to
Sure.
read the medieval sources. You had the whole thing with the Photian schism, right? But then in the 1200s, in 1205, so this is right after the Crusaders take Constantinople, the Crusaders go to war with the Bulgarians. Now the Bulgarians were going to war with the Byzantine Empire as well. Ionita, what's his name? I believe the Bulgarian's name was Ionita, which means little John. And they go to war with the Crusaders, and they're like, "Hey, can you crown our king something?" I'm going off memory here. So, and the Crusaders said no, and so then they appealed to the Pope and became uniats on paper anyway for about 30 years, and then of course they just got a new king, and they're like, all right, we're going Orthodox again, like in like 1230 or 35 or something like that.
Well, I think
so
one of the like things to point out here with this, and I specifically included the caption in this headline. It says Bulgaria writes new chapter in a long story of demographic decline. This, when you're dealing with these groups that are coming up with some of these sources, like demographers are generally secular, and they're generally writing. They're supposed to be writing from like an apolitical or an a-religious purview. They're just like reporting. Like for a demographer, an increase, just as an increase, is good news. So they include here that Bulgaria faces huge demographic challenges, but optimists point to a recent migration trends as cause for at least cautious optimism. Now, what that translates to is that non-native Bulgarians are migrating into the country, and they're thinking that that's going to replace the native population. So therefore, yay, let's all celebrate, right, that we're going to have a demographic increase in Bulgaria. But what that translates to us is, as it's probably going to be somebody from North Africa or one of these war-torn regions in the Middle East, and it's not going to be a native Bulgarian population. So is that really a win, right? Like, is that something to be optimistic about, that you're going to, I mean, not to get all conspiracy theory on you guys, but I think there's a little bit of truth to this idea of a replacement, and some of the demographics are clearly pointing in that direction. That when they talk about, like, in the United States, for example, any kind of increase, they're typically not isolating on whether Americans are actually having their own demographic increase, or if it's due to an influx of immigrants. So yeah, that's just something to point out there.
Yeah.
Like, just because you might see an uptick in Bulgarian demographics, it's not necessarily something to start hurrahing, because you want to make sure that you're actually seeing native Bulgarians having children and baptizing their children in your communion and faith. Greece, I had quite a few people on this post that I put out yesterday about the ecumenical patriarch, saying, well, he also oversees Greece, and there's millions of Orthodox in Greece, but Greece is very much in the same boat as much of the rest of Eastern Europe. It's been in a sort of demographic free fall for the last century at least, and it's not projected to do any better. Russia's a super interesting one, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time. I know, Allan, I think you've got interest in kind of the situation of what's happening in Russia, and I have specifically included here these snapshots from the Pew studies. I'm going to talk about the Pew studies here in a minute, but I know that our Orthodox friends love the Pew studies, so I wanted to make sure that I included them in here. But we have quite a bit of information about the religious trends in Russia that is oftentimes very contradictory. So yeah, I'd like to dive into. Do you have any opening thoughts for the Russian situation, Allan, or do you want to just?
Well, of course, it's hard to get reliable data out of Russia. It's hard enough for Eastern Europe, but for Russia, it's that much harder. And Russia, believe it or not, if you go to Moscow, there's a ton of immigrants there. Now, they're not the kind of immigrants you see in Canada, the States. It's not Chinese or Pakistani or Filipino or Punjabi or anything like that. It's like from the old former Soviet republics, like Kazakhstan or Tajikistan or Moldova or something like that. The population of non-Russians in Moscow is huge. Now, the difference is these people assimilate, not religiously to the Orthodox Church, but they speak Russian because of the old communist days, and stuff like that. But the native Russian population has a abysmally low birth rate.
Yeah.
And I sent you the thing with Peter Zeihan, or Zane, I don't know how to pronounce his name, who's kind of a geopolitics expert. And Russia right now is about 30% non-Russian. It's Chechen, it's Tatar, it's all these other groups, right? It's not traditional Russians. And these other groups aren't Orthodox. And although their birth rates are declining too, they do seem to have higher birth rates than the native Russians. So,
well, you see, I mean, as far as what we can get that's as close to what we would, consider non-propagandizing sources, it seems like at one time, and I'm not quite for sure what Putin did, he managed, if you look at the one on the right, he managed to get the birth rates slightly above the death rates around the 2010s, and then it just started to drop again around the late 2010s, and the death rates started to increase again. So, he had a moment there where it looked like it could potentially be a little bit hopeful for them. Now, one of the challenges with Russia is what I was just alluding to there, just dealing with the state of Russian propaganda, which they have been experts at this for well over a century at this point. There was this phenomenon called the Potemkin facades where, gosh, the first time I had ever heard about this was in Amity Schleil's book, The Common Man. But basically, what would happen is you would have these Western bourgeois liberal elites who were invited by the Stalin government to come over to Russia, mainly like reporters and writers and things like that. And they would be shown around and they would see the wonders and the amazing like social experiment that was taking place in Russia, and then they would go back home. And you have Walter Duranty. He wins a Pulitzer Prize for his writing on Russia. You have George Bernard Shaw, the Irish poet. He's writing on this, but it was literally a facade. If you look at the picture there, they would like clean up and paint the front of these buildings, but the back of the buildings were like crumbling and like deteriorating. But that's all that they ever saw. The Westerners saw, these few that went over there, they would see like people eating. It might be a massive table of food that they're eating from, but that might be all of the food that the whole population had. Like they were like literally being hand walked through these like small isolated areas. And then they would go back to the US. And I swear, Alan, I see the Orthobros love Russia. And it so much reminds me of the Potemkin facades at times when they're throwing out like these, like what's clearly in this longstanding tradition of Russian disinformation. I'm not saying that all of Russia is full. It's not like, yeah, we certainly have our own campaign of different disinformation around these things too. But it doesn't mean that therefore that we are to turn around and swallow the Russia pill wholesale, which it seems like it's what a lot of them end up doing.
Yeah, like Russia has kind of like I think the reason the Orthobros like Russia, it's because it's anti-Western. It's anti-Western. A lot of Eastern European is anti-Western, but Russia is on a whole new level. And it's like, okay, I can be a devout Christian and anti-Western,
It's just, yeah, it kind of allows you to like, kind of stick your nose up at the West, which a lot of us, I'm very critical of the West in many senses, in many respects.
Me too. And I have some Russian ancestry too. So I mean,
yeah, and I would actually say, Alan, I mean, like, I really don't want to get too political with all of this, but there's quite a bit that I actually sympathize with Putin on, and his situation and the Russian situation in general. Not just, I mean, Putin's just he's just a political guy. That's what he is. I can sympathize with him on like a political level. I can sympathize with the Russians on a national level. It doesn't mean that we swallow the whole pill, right, of what they're feeding the Western, because they've had a long-standing history of doing this. And if you're at least at all self-aware, you would just acknowledge, hey, maybe they're just like holding me by the hand and showing me one of these facades that they have always done with Westerners. So we have here Georgia, the Belarus, they're all going through their own demographic collapse as well. You will see what I think is probably the linchpin of a lot of the demographics that are going to come out of Eastern Europe, in terms of how unpredictable a lot of this is the free fall beginning in 2022 of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. And even the worst predictions that we had for the Ukraine are going to be outweighing, it's going to be outweighed by this thing that none of us saw coming, which just shows you how challenging these things are.
Can you go back to that last slide for a second?
Sure.
Okay, I thought Georgia was able to get their demographics back up a tiny bit.
The latest that I had was, this one shows 2022. From 2021 to 2022, a pretty stark decline.
That's COVID, obviously.
Yeah, and that could be a number of things like COVID.
Yeah, and
depopulation.
And COVID hurt, and COVID hurt everyone's demographics. It's for 2.5 years. It's not like, hey, let's stay home and have babies. What Georgia was doing to try to get their demographics up, and I think it was working for a while, but again, COVID, probably threw it off, is that the patriarch of Georgia, who's like the national figure there, he said he would baptize every third kid. And of course, families want a kid baptized by the patriarch. That's amazing, right?
Mm.
And so for a while there, until COVID, it seems like it actually brought up some it brought them up to about replacement level. And but that's a pretty unique situation to Georgia. I mean, it's hard to do that in any other country.
Yeah, I mean this scale is really, it's only 2014 to 2022, and from 2014 to 2020, you have a fairly, I mean that's kind of what you expect to see in a stable population, right? Like you don't want to see arcs. You can't expect to see increases like sustained over like forever, because eventually you're going to see things kind of start to plateau. But what you don't want to see is you don't want to see arcs, and you don't want to see these like dramatic steep declines. So yeah, they were clearly doing something, at least from those. From what we can see here, 2014 to 2020, they were doing something right, because it looks like a fairly stable line there. But yeah, no, with the Ukraine situation, with COVID, and then with war, so disease and war, right? These are always going to upset our predictions of how these things are going to go, and usually they're not going to like increase. If you can just say, hey, like we're going to anticipate war and we're going to anticipate disease. You can pretty much like logically deduce that that's going to be a decline in your overall population, not an increase, which leads us to the Russian-Ukrainian war. And Alan, I know you had some thoughts about that conflict overall and the demographic sort of tragedy that is.
This war is such a tragedy because I have some Ukrainian and some Russian background in me. Ukrainians and Russians are brothers. Their language is very similar. That they've always been, part of like the same empire. I mean, historically, they're both Eastern Orthodox, although they're both highly secularized populations. If you've ever been to Ukraine, you would know that. Like in Ukraine, you have the two churches fighting over the churches, but let's be honest, they're fighting over empty churches, right? It doesn't matter if it's Russian, like affiliated with Moscow or affiliated with the local church. Both churches are empty. My parents have been to Russia. I've never been to Russia. Like we're from like the Saratov area on the Volga. My parents have been there. I haven't. But this war, like keep in mind, Russia and Ukraine already have really bad birth rates and demographics. But with this current war, it's like pouring gasoline on a fire. Again, it's the youth who die in this war. And Ukraine has had like their population has dropped about 10 million since the war started. Now they haven't all been killed. A lot of them has fled to the west. Like in my city, I see Ukrainians everywhere. Like I see I see them at the grocery store. They're the clerks. I see them but like the truth is the vast majority of Eastern Orthodox who leave their country, now the church rates in their country are bad enough, but once they leave and go to a non-Orthodox country, their church rates just plummet. Like in my city, there's about 10,000 native Russian speakers. And we used to have two Russian churches, but now there's only one. It's actually not far from me. It's walking distance from my house, and it's about the size of my living room. About like it's tiny, and like they get 20 or 30 people every Sunday. On a holiday, they might have a bit more, like on Pascha and stuff like that. But no, like of 10,000. Now, there's a couple other Orthodox churches in my city that are, I suppose, a Russian could go to. Just because you're Russian doesn't mean you have to go to the Russian church. But like, but I don't think the Serbians, like, there's a huge Serbian church just south of the city. It's technically not in the city, it's outside the city limits. And I know a few Russian speakers that go there for convenience, because you don't want to drive for half an hour up to the where I live, if you live in the far south. But I don't know, they but I don't think there's a lot of people filling up the churches from these expats, because there are a ton of Ukrainians in my city now, like brand new Ukrainians. And
yeah, I mean, I saw not that long ago, and actually it was in preparation for this talk. I didn't even include the numbers of what they're projecting. I tend to lean towards the side of saying that we're probably up to 1 million casualties at this point in that conflict. And I just saw this image. I don't know whether they were Ukrainian. I don't know whether they were Russian. It doesn't really matter. It was these two dead boys in a trench. 20, 20, 21, 22, 23 years old, however old they were. And it was just like, it made me tear up, because these boys should be having families. They should be getting married. They should be having families, and they're gone. Like, they're not coming back. They're dead in a trench. And it's like, and then you don't get that back. You're not going to get these million boys back. And that's what I always try to tell people. Like, when you like convert these things into numbers, you always have to like realize, like, oh, it's just, Stalin once said that one death is a tragedy, a million is like, when you just blithely throw out that number, like, we have to realize that these are, yes, they are separated from us as Catholics, but I in many respects view the Orthodox as brethren. And like, these million dead boys is something that we should all like be, lamenting. And
no, it's a very sad war. This war breaks my heart. I know a lot of Ukrainian and Russian people. Like, I know Ukrainians from the eastern part of Ukraine, and their city is just like I know some from Zaporozhye. Like, they have a nuclear power plant there, and for a while their nuclear plant was on fire. They managed to put it out, but if you're not careful, you're going to have another Chernobyl there.
All right, so leaving Eastern Europe, did you have any final thoughts on Russia there, Alan?
No, I think we've said what we need to about that.
Honestly, I didn't include much on South America, Africa, or Asia, because the numbers are, as you can see, fairly negligible. One of the things, and again, we're going to get to Pew here in a second, but like Alan has mentioned this, if you look at the African countries with large Orthodox populations, the Pew Research Center doesn't differentiate between Oriental Orthodox and the Eastern Orthodox. And the three countries that they mentioned there with these large Orthodox populations are actually, I double checked. I wasn't for sure about Eritrea, however you would say that. But all three of them have their own Oriental Orthodox churches that were actually making up these large numbers of Orthodox populations.
Yeah, in terms of Eastern Orthodox, there's very little in Africa.
In Asia, it's not so much that it's on the decrease, it's that the Catholics and the charismatics, the evangelical churches have just especially the evangelical churches have exploded in Asia. So they're starting to dwarf the what Orthodox presence was there. South America is very negligible. I found some places in Peru, like in Lima, the main city of Peru, you could find 2 parishes that were Orthodox. And I just included here from Ubi Petros, because he was asking for some places for somebody that reached out to him from Peru, but the nearest parish from where this person in Peru was 415 miles away from them. And
Yeah,
then
there's very little presence there, and I think the reason is because they never got a lot of Slavic immigrants there.
yeah,
I mean, Brazil got a really small amount, but yeah, so there's no Slavic immigrants there. Like, if you're like, it's bad enough in the States, if you want to be Orthodox and you're not in a city.
I've
But
included
if you're in,
Australia. Oh, go ahead.
well, I, I'm kind of interested. What's the situation in Australia?
I mean, as far as what I could gather from um, Orthodox specifically, since that's what we're looking at, it's fairly negligible. You have about 2.5% of the population in Australia identifies as Orthodox, and that's mainly from Greek, Ukrainian, Serbian, and Russian immigrants, which was the same that I found for Canada as well. There's not
Yeah,
like a
well,
large native population of Australia or Canada coming that's at least right now that we can see coming into the Orthodox Church.
so, 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 so get this. You talk about Canada. If you come to my area of Canada, like I'm in Alberta, I'm in the prairies. Like in Calgary, where I am, I'm born in Edmonton. But in Calgary, there's like the mountains. You can see the mountains from our city. So it's the end of the prairies, but the prairies go all the way to like Ontario even. And like if you drive around the Canadian prairies, there are a ton of 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 Orthodox and Eastern Catholic churches. They're Ukrainian because there's a lot of Ukrainian farming families came here in the late 1800s, early 1900s, because they had a program where you could get a free piece of land. And once you got this, um, and now those churches still exist, but the amount, like they might do like one liturgy a month in them. They're empty now. In the cities, they're doing a bit better. Like, I'm not sure about Orthodox, but the Ukrainian Catholics in my hometown, I think there's about 10 parishes. So it's doing a bit better, but in the city I'm in, there's only 2 parishes.
Well, as far as net growth that I could tell from both Australia and Canada, it appears that there is net growth in both countries. But going back to the whole, uh, you know, great replacement theory, it's not a net growth due to native fecundity. It's a net growth due to an influx of immigrants, and you can pretty much guess where they're not coming from majority Christian countries.
Yeah, yeah. Like I think the only Christian country a lot of immigrants come from to the West, and by West I mean Canada and the States. I'm not sure about Australia, although it's closer to them. It's probably from the Philippines,
Hmm.
and they're a big bastion of Catholicism in Asia. But that's pretty much the only bastion of Catholicism in Asia.
All right. Well, without further ado, Orthodoxy in America. How are you doing on time, Alan? I got to be out of here probably in about 30 minutes. I
All
don't know
right,
how.
we'll go on your. It's
Okay.
10 a.m. here, so
Okay. Orthodoxy in America. This is probably the one we're hour 45 minutes in. It's probably the one that most people are super interested in, and I try to be pretty as comprehensive as I could be with this particular one. So I'll try to give it what justice I can here with the time that we have remaining. But Orthodoxy in America. It's an interesting story. All right, so I keep hinting at it. I did want to get to the pew situation because Alan, I'm sure you've seen this. I've included some screenshots here. The Ortho Bros do not like the pew studies, and I think there's some good reasons to have an issue with the pew, but it's not necessarily for the same reasons that they would want it to be. It's really, I think, for them, and you may agree with this, Alan, I think it's just an attempt to poison the well. If they can just poison the Pew studies like wholesale, then you don't have to discuss them. You don't have to account for them. But as far as methodology goes, I mean, Pew, their transparency is there. They tell you who their partners are. They give you their methodology. As we've pointed out a couple times, it even tends to favor the Orthodox, because Pew, this is one of the issues that I would have with Pew, is they don't differentiate between Oriental and Eastern Orthodox. So that's something that actually favors the Orthodox in their Pew studies. If you were to remove that and isolate for that, their numbers are even worse. They give you their sample quality. It's based on random dialing. And then they adjust for certain demographic weights. I mean, this is all like standard practices for any kind of like statistics that you're going to like try to pull. Now, we all know that there's challenges with statistics. There's the famous Mark Twain quote, right? That there's liars, there's damn liars, and then there's statisticians. But, as far as Pew goes, they're on par with just about any other statistic, high up there ranking statistic organization that you could find. Now, future projections of religious demographics, as I've alluded to before, are very difficult. You can't predict war, you can't predict migrations, technology, all of this stuff. But I say that the burden of proof in all of this is actually on the Eastern Orthodox, especially this contingent of the Ortho Bros. The burden of proof is on them, because they're the ones claiming a massive explosion of growth without any really scientific evidence to back it up. Yes, we're all drawing from the same available data, but for the most recent projections that we can see, that they have a heavy burden on them if they're going to say that there is an overall net, not just a net growth, but an explosion of orthodoxy in America. I would also point. Go for it.
Like, okay, you live in the yeah. Okay, you can continue this, and then I'll.
So then, like, one of the things I think that you guys, this is all science 101, research 101, just knowing the difference between anecdotal evidence versus empirical evidence. I'm not saying there's no value to anecdotal evidence, but if you're making the kind of claims that these people are making, and if you notice what they're doing, it's almost all entirely anecdotal evidence. And if that's all that you have, then you don't have a lot. So when you hear these people, and I've included some clips, again, I'm not picking on individual people. I've had some nice conversations actually with a few of these guys. But when you hear things like, in my parish, I see, or I hear, I read all of these other parishes, or when they're saying your data is from 2010, like, they're all dealing at that point in anecdotal speculation. Whereas at the very least with empirical evidence, you have information that's gathered through, observation, experimentation, measurement. And the idea is that it's repeatable, but it's also falsifiable, right? That's the important thing. If they're making claims that they're having this massive growth and we can't falsify it, then, it's all just he said, she said at that point. And they're pretty much just, I think, either going back to that Martin Sheen quote, either, they're deceiving themselves or they're engaged in deception of others, which neither one is really the kind of thing that we want to be engaging in as Christians. And just finally, I know, Alan, I think you've used this statistic before. They hate this statistic, right? Which is Eastern Orthodox Christianity in the 21st century. Among Christians globally, Orthodox share is falling. Catholic Protestant shares are increasing. And there's some other pictures that I've seen from this statistics. They absolutely hate seeing these because it kind of is stark contrast to the claims that they're making. But if you go down to the methodology, it's all laid out. I included just a clip of it here. You can see how Pew gathers their information. There's nothing like hidden. There's nothing like overtly nefarious about what they're doing. They're just presenting evidence that is contra to the Ortho Bro claims, which is, I believe, why they're so adamantly against the Pew research.
Yeah, and let me ask you something. Speaking of anecdotal, you live in the United States. I'm in Canada here. Mm-hmm. You live in the United States. Okay, you have lived in. Is it okay if I can say
Yeah,
where
no,
you
yeah, no, yeah, it's fine.
you live in the state of Maine and you've lived in the state of Virginia. So I've got two questions. In Maine and Virginia, when you walk around, when you go to the grocery store, when you drive your kids to soccer games, when you just live your life, like, do you notice a Protestant presence, both evangelical and or mainline?
Oh, my entire life, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
Saturated.
Do you
You almost
notice
take it for granted.
the Catholic presence?
Yep.
Yeah, it's probably a bit smaller because America's a Protestant nation. But do you notice an Orthodox presence in your everyday life in America?
The only time I noticed the Orthodox presence before all of this, uh, I'm going out of my way, but no, living an everyday life. The only time I noticed it was the Greek festival outside the Greek Orthodox Church once a year. That was it.
Yeah, that's almost. And to be honest, that's probably the time where most of those Greeks, the only time of year they're at church. Like in my city, the Greek Orthodox. See, a thing that in my city, there's three churches like this, three Orthodox churches. There's the Greek, the Ukrainian, and the Serbian. Well, you have an Orthodox church, you'll have the Greek Community Center right next to it. Like I used to work just across the street from the Greek Orthodox Church, and there's a big Greek Community Center attached to it. So they're kind of, yeah, like the Greek Community Center puts on like dance classes and stuff. Ukrainian church, there's a Ukrainian and it has a Ukrainian community center, right? So it's kind of for the Ukrainian community. So they're both feeding off each other. Same with Serbian, the Serbian festival. But like, yeah, but like in your everyday life, though, you walk through the streets of Maine or the streets of Virginia, you don't notice this. And the only reason you notice it on X is because you're in this part of X. A lot of people don't talk about religion at all on X, right? They talk about sports, they talk about politics, they talk about film, whatever, right? But we happen to be in the apologetic sphere, and so we
Give me 1 second
run
here, Alan.
into.
I'm sorry. I just got to check. Are you okay?
Can I say hello?
How about I'll let you at the end, okay?
Okay.
Sorry, I have to edit this part out. It's my child checking on something.
Okay, fair enough.
Uh,
Yeah, so
so
I mean, you walk in everyday America, just walk around, drive around, you don't notice their presence.
yeah,
Online, there's a lot of people who are loud online.
yeah.
Like online, you can amplify your voice, but the truth is, when you walk, like you probably notice more of an Islamic presence in where you are, or where, well, maybe not in Virginia,
Well,
right?
they
You
were
probably,
the Muslims. They even if their numbers were comparable to the Orthodox population in Virginia, the Muslims made their presence known because they were actively building mosques, or they were actively converting old storefronts into mosques. Like, you knew the Muslim presence. It was it's more palpable in real life than it may be, yeah, like comparable to the internet presence that you find with some of these groups. You would certainly find the Muslim presence in my
yeah,
day-to-day life. I would say, oh, they just turned that old storefront into a mosque now. I hadn't noticed that, but there they are.
yeah, like like for me in my city, I notice the Islamic presence way more, and the like in Canada, there's a huge Punjabi population, like the Sikhs. I noticed their presence way more. Of course, it's all immigrants, right? But um, but you've got the refugees from Ukraine. Like they don't go to church. Like I've talked to a lot of these people, and like I'm a huge fan of Ukraine. I love Ukraine. I'm part Ukrainian. I don't like this war that Putin's doing, but I recognize there are sketchy people in Ukraine as well. Like Zelensky. I hate Zelensky. I hate
Yeah.
that guy. I don't like Putin either. So I mean, I'm just I want peace between two people. I don't think the Ukrainians or the Russian people want to be in this war, but
No, I don't think they do either.
anyway.
I included this particular picture here because this kind of like to me illustrates one of the challenges when you're like talking to people online. And granted, I do most of my stuff through X, which doesn't like lend itself to having the most in-depth kind of conversations. But somebody threw this back at me, kind of unaware of what was happening here. So when you're looking at like raw numbers, they said, well, look at Russia, right? 1910 to 2010. Look at that increase in Russians. Like clearly Russia is on the rise. And I say, but you gotta realize, right? Like we're looking at this from like global trends, right? And even though like proportional to Russia, there was an increase, proportional to the rest of the world, they haven't kept up. Like it's not comparable to like other Christian communities. Like the explosion of just if we're looking at this from a religious lens, the explosions of like a Catholic demographics out of Africa in the last 100 years. Like there's nothing comparable with any of these numbers to what you would see with the explosion of the Catholics in Africa. So you always got to be careful when you're dealing with raw numbers. Go ahead.
Yeah, and keep in mind, a lot of these converts, what you don't hear is a lot of them are in the front door, out the back. Now, this is true for all converts too. I'm not going to say there's.
I have an interesting thing about that, Alan. If you want to save that just for a minute, we can, because there's
sure.
one guy I think doing interesting work. But when we get to him in just a minute.
All right.
Now, as far as the U.S. demographics go as a whole, just quickly here, right? Like we have 341 million population in the U.S. We have 8,110 million worldwide. So the U.S. makes up approximately 4.2% of the worldwide population. There is a overall demographic population decline that's taking place in the U.S., so we have to factor that in as well when you're projecting forward into the future. And I just was kind of having fun with these numbers. So I just said, if you took every single American all across the United States, took every single American and converted them to Christianity, qua Christianity today, it would make up 15% of the world Christian population. In early reports, now this would be to sidebar, I just noted that in early reports, there is something of a post-pandemic religious revival that seems to be taking place. We see this across the board with the Catholic Church. It seems to be happening in. We've had some pretty reliable evidence coming back from France. Seems to be happening in the Orthodox Church as well to a degree, though they seem to think that is like in isolation to what's happening everywhere else. Again, we would have to have a separate conversation about what's happening with other religions demographics, but to kind of keep with the situation with the Orthodox, this is what I call the Orthodox dilemma. And if I can like present this in such a way that it's not just like you don't get lost in the weeds of all of this. Basically, what I'm saying is that if the Orthodox were projected to be 300 million, and Alan, as you've pointed out when we were originally going over these numbers, those projections include with the Oriental Orthodox as well.
Yep.
So when I drew these numbers, Alan pointed out, hey, if you actually look, the data set that I was using was drawing from, it just lumps Orthodox in as Orthodox without any consideration.
Yeah, because they both use the word Orthodox.
But anyways, I was trying to be fair.
You can take that 300 million down to 200 million when you throw in Orientals.
I wanted to be as generous, Alan, with these numbers as I possibly could towards our Orthodox brothers out there so that they couldn't accuse us of anything like tweaking the numbers. I said, look, I'm going to throw the best numbers that I can their way to give them the best possible outcome here, right? So I gave them the 300 million, right? Compared to a projected 1.5 billion Roman Catholics by the year 2050. That's a disparity of 1.2 billion, right? So keep in mind those numbers again, right? When you're dealing with the numbers that are in the billions, you have a disparity between the two of 1.2 billion, which means that the Orthodox would need a conversion rate of 48 million converts per year to catch up with Catholics by the year 2050. Now, there are 334 million Americans right now in the United States and 199 million Western Europeans in Europe. Minus the 7 million in the US and in Europe that are already counted as Orthodox. And again, I went with the high numbers there too. It appears that it might actually be lower than that, but giving them the high numbers there, that would give them 526 million combined, were every single person in the United States and Europe to convert to Orthodoxy tomorrow. Okay, does that kind of make sense what I'm doing there, Alan? I know I didn't run this by you, but I want. Okay, so if every single person in the U.S. converted, and in Western Europe, there would still be a disparity of 974 million people. So they would still need 38 million converts per year for the next 25 years to catch up with us.
Yeah.
Now, this doesn't even account for the net losses that they have to overcome in other places and all the other places that we've been talking about here, right? Let's see. Now, quickly, again, I don't want to I just try to use this to hammer the point home. But in the United States, just looking at the U.S., since this is where they're so hyper-focused on right now, in the U.S., you have a 45% evangelical mainline Protestant, and that's 154 million people. 23% of the U.S. is unaffiliated. That's 79 million people. 22% of the U.S. is Catholic, 75 million, all the way down to 0.5% are Eastern Orthodox at 1.7 million people. Okay. So I was like, look, I just want to give them some numbers. And these aren't realistic numbers. I'm just trying to be generous. But if you said that 5% of all of the Protestants, 5% of all Catholics in the U.S., and 10% of all the unaffiliated in the U.S. tomorrow converted to Eastern Orthodoxy, that would give them 15.3 million people. Okay. Now, 15.3 million plus the 1.7 million that it was already there. I know this is a little convoluted here, but that would give them 17 million people. That is still only 5.5% of total converts between Protestant, unaffiliated, and Catholic. That's still only 4.9% of the U.S. population, and it's only 0.7% of the world Christian population. So the whole point of all of that is just to say, they've got a massive demographic hurdle that they have to overcome. Going back to the Jay Dyer thing, which he loves to do so often, talking about the thousands of Catholics leaving the church for Orthodoxy. I don't know if you've ever seen him say this, Alan, but he says it quite a lot, right? And he's always the thousands of people. What's that?
I've blocked him on X, and keep in mind, like he had blocked me originally, but then he unblocked me to try to invite me into his Discord server, and then I blocked him when I was.
Well, I don't want to say that there's kind of two options. Either he's self-deceived or he's deceiving. There's only two options there, right? So whichever one it is, leave it to the audience to make up their own minds. But okay, so thousands of Catholics. What's that?
Well, I saw Jay Dyer once post that 7 million. It's oh, we used to be 500,000. Now we're 7 million in the last 5-10 years. That thing we showed. I can't remember the exact numbers. I've seen him post that. So he probably thinks that's true.
Yeah, and there's a little bit of a back and forth with him and the guy I want to bring up here in a minute. But so all of this is in this slide is just to say, if you were to take those thousands, and look, every single soul that we lose is a tragedy and it's sad. But as far as just stepping back from it all and looking and keeping perspective, so let's just say there's 1.4 billion Catholics worldwide, 75.6 million in the U.S. Let's say 10,000 leave for Eastern Orthodoxy, right? I'm trying to give kind of a high number there. That's still 0.1% of the U.S. Catholic population, 0.01% of the U.S. Catholic population, and 0.0007% of the worldwide Catholic population. And so if he got 10,000 a year for the next 25 years, it would still only come up to 250,000, which is 0.01% of the worldwide Catholic population, which I'm sorry, it's not that impressive in terms of sheer numbers, if that's all that they're concerned about. So this is the guy I was getting at, Alan. I don't know if you've seen this guy. He's I don't know how you say his name. It's not Nami, maybe. I'm sorry, Matthew, if you happen to watch this. So he is a demographer. I don't know if by trade, but he certainly is involved in writing some research papers. And I actually included it at the bottom here at Jay Dyer's. When he shared his recent studies, Jay Dyer does his typical like Dyer tactic where he says, well, it sounds like you have, and to keep in mind, this guy, Matthew, is Orthodox, and he's trying to present the Orthodox with scientific, what we were talking about, empirical evidence for the claims that they're making. Jay and all of them are like losing their minds when he shares the results of the stuff that he's finding. So of course, as is their tactic, it's poison the well. It's come debate
He's an
me.
ecumenist. He's an ecumenist.
And you can see here, like, it sounds like you have an agenda, poisoning the well, and then perhaps you should come debate me on geopolitical topics, as if that's it's their whole shtick, Alan. I know you know this. I'm like not telling you anything you don't know, but it's so tiring at times. And look, this guy, if you read his, I clipped both of his studies that he did in 2024. Their methodology, they laid it all out. It's clear what they were doing. It's clear what they were trying to do. It's very isolated. It's a isolated snapshot of specific things. It doesn't tell a wider picture, but they're trying to begin the process of collecting data and presenting evidence to make a case for something. So the stuff that he concludes, as far as these papers are concerned, is that as you were pointing out, Alan, the engagement of converts appears to be decreasing over time. Go figure. So that means these people are coming in super excited. You follow them because retention rates matter. This is one thing these people never really want to discuss when it comes to these, we're winning thousands of converts. Yeah, but are you keeping thousands of converts? That's like an important thing to add to the conversation. So Matthew and his et al. Concluded that engagement is decreasing over time. There's no statistical variance between converts between age, sex, and gender. The likelihood of moving, they're looking for specific indicators to show what the retention rates of these converts are. And there isn't really, as far as what he was able to determine in these two sets of papers that they put out, there's nothing that indicates necessarily high retention rates. Then he put out, so he's called Orthodox History on X, and he put out a series of findings from a cooperative election study, all the data there that basically just comes to the conclusion that Orthodoxy in America is not growing. I don't know if you saw this, Alan. I think I might have shared it with you when it first making the Ortho Bros were losing their minds with him. This is when Jay Dyer and all Luigi, these guys were in his comments. Let's see. So
we just baptized 20 people at my parish. Blah blah blah.
And so and I think he's trying to be sincere. I've seen a video of him online where he's doing an interview. He seems to believe that there is a overall partial increase in Orthodox converts in the United States. But what the point he's trying to make is, this is where the Orthodox bros tend to be very myopic. They fail to see the whole picture, is that it has to be off. It's only offsetting the otherwise significant decline that had been taking place in the Orthodox Church in America for the last several decades. And I Yeah. Well, I shared this with you, Alan. I hadn't really gone out on my Twitter public with this or anything, but this letter here to the left of the screen is the historical church that was founded by their saint, Alexis Toth, who was basically de facto the inventor of the Orthodox Church in America. They've had to sell off his parish, the parish that he founded, due to lack of numbers.
Lack of numbers and aging population.
Yeah.
And I think the converts are only in a few selective churches. There's some churches that are designed more for outreach. If you go to Father Josiah Trenham's church, that's more of a convert. But there's a lot of their churches who stay empty and have to sell off property like this one.
Well, I know, like in like Toth's church would be in Pennsylvania. This other, they were really upset about this one. This guy's Oriental Orthodox that just bought out the parish of Massachusetts. The bulk of the Orthodox presence for the last 100 years in the United States has been in New England. And when you're seeing the decreases that are taking place in Orthodoxy in the United States, it's mainly the depopulation that's taking place of Orthodox demographics in New England. The converts seem to be, at least I think according to Name's statistics that he presented, are like south and southwest of the United States, which is interesting. But the long and short of what his findings are, and they just seem to not be able to wrap their minds around what he was saying. And again, it's either deception or self-deception. All he said in his findings is that you have a partial increase with these converts. It's being offset, though, by the overall decrease, steady decrease that has been happening. So what that equals to is a net neutral. Very simple math, right? 10 plus minus 10 or negative 10 is going to give you 0. So the Orthodox, the Ortho Bros cannot, whatever reason, all of the like comments that I've been seeing that were feedback from the very little, empirical evidence that we have about what's happening is that it's not a net growth because they have to offset the net losses that they've been having. I don't know, again, whether or not this is their own inability to grasp this very simple concept or whether just intentionally being like, they're trying to save face from all of this stuff. Because Allan, the thing that I've seen recently that they've been doing is they've kind of switched to being a little bit like they're pretending like it's the classic Mott and Bailey tactic, right? Like they're falling back now that, oh, we've just been kind of joking that whole time that, they're joking now that they're using the number of billions instead of 1,000, right? Like we've got billions of converts that are coming in. And to me, in my mind, it's like, yeah, because evidence is starting to come out that contradicts your statement. So for you guys to save face, you're going to fall back. Like we were just joking, guys, the whole time. We weren't seriously thinking that the Orthodox Church is like like that one meme. What was it? I have to go all the way back to the beginning of the slides, but it was some massive growth over 4 years. Like I think they genuinely believed that was taking place. I don't think that they're like making it saving face. So conclusion, is Orthodoxy growing?
No.
I don't see any way to,
and not in America,
yeah.
Or certainly not in their traditional countries.
Yep. And that's basically, that's the entire presentation that I have here as far as this goes. That's pretty much unless you severely isolate this very specific demographic from everything else in the world of Orthodoxy, there's just no way to objectively conclude that Orthodoxy is growing. That's not to say that they're not winning some converts to their churches. I do believe that. But, Allan, we're seeing that in other places as well, too. Like, it's not just that's not just limited to Orthodox.
And the thing is, the rates of retention you brought up, that's equally important. Now, of course, all faiths struggle with that. Catholicism and Islam and it's like, are there going to be rates of retention? Well, I don't know. A lot of these people are in the front door, out the back. For example, like I write for 1 Peter 5. My editor is Timothy Flanders. He's former Orthodox. And I could talk about a bunch more, but the thing is, when people convert to Orthodoxy, it's kind of like, they shout it on the mountaintops, but when they leave, they just leave.
Yeah.
They don't really.
That's kind of that old C.S. Eliot quote, right? Like these things just like they end with a whimper, right? You don't see the tail end usually.
Yeah, and like apparently a lot of these people are kind of like alt-right people and young single men, and once they find out that cute Slavic girl doesn't want anything to do with this alt-right garbage and won't talk to them or go out with them, I don't know, they'll start searching elsewhere for religion. So
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, look, I do think that we have a pressing need in the Catholic Church here in the United States to be appealing to the kind of demographics of men that feel like there's no place for them because they feel like the church is, over Karenized, over Susanized, right? Like they feel like there's too much of a feminine presence in the church. Okay. And it's like, yeah, look, okay, fair. That's something that we could probably work on as, in our individual parishes overall. But the Catholic Church, especially here in the, you and Al, before we went live, Alan, you and I were talking about, like, I don't know as much about Canada, but I know the Catholic Church, much of the history of the Catholic Church in the United States of America, and it's been hard fought for us. It's been 200 years of us like struggling to carve out not just an existence for ourselves here, but to the point today where, you see, yeah, okay, like you could grant how deeply rooted his Catholicism in his day-to-day life, but we just had a Catholic president. We have a Catholic vice president. We have a Catholic first lady. 6 of our 9 Supreme Courts are Catholic. Our Catholics pervade our academia. They pervade our governmental institutions. Like Catholics
And we have
have
tons of hospitals and universities. And,
yeah. And we've worked hard, and the Protestants all along the way fought us tooth and nail. We had a political party formed in the United States that sought to eliminate the Catholic Church. So this whole idea to me, Alan, that these neophytes are going to show up and they're going to like explode and they're going to take over, like we're going to win. Like I've seen some of them say that the United States will be Orthodox in the next decade or something like that. And, it's like,
I've heard United States, Germany, and Mexico. And I'm sure I've heard other countries as well. But
yeah, but it's like, okay, guys, to me, it's beyond just the like historical ignorance of it all. It just shows, where I think Catholics really struggle with the Orthodox, Alan, for the simple fact that it's just a lack of exposure. And Catholics don't really know how to respond to some of these objections that are being tossed at them. So hopefully today, at least for this specific conversation, you and I would have to come back to have a wider conversation about the demographic situation of Roman Catholics. But that's its own
that
thing,
would be
right?
long,
Yeah.
because I think like the Catholics have, like, I think there's about over 50 Catholic majority countries, not to mention significant presences in non Catholic countries like America. Like I think in our lifetime, I don't want to be too like I think the Catholics could take over the evangelicals, because I think evangelicalism in America is in free fall. It's collapsing. When I was following politics, like 05, 06, the evangelical bloc was huge. They had like Pat Robertson, they had Falwell, they had the moral majority and stuff. But like that's all gone. Like, who are the big voices in the culture now? It's Matt Walsh, Michael Knowles, Candace Owens. Like it's the Catholics now. It's the evangelicals are collapsing, and I'm not going to lie, they've done some good for the culture, but I think their allegiance to Zionism has compromised them in a lot of areas.
Yeah.
But that's
overall, they're overall neoconservative. They kind of bought it hook, line, and sinker. For those of us that remember the world 20 years ago. So yeah, no, and I think the Catholic Church, love us or hate us, like we did the legwork. Like as Europe was imploding, Catholic missionaries were like, okay, well they like it just in my mind it's providential, right? That we at that moment just started exploring the seas. We opened up the oceanic trade routes, and we did the legwork. And we got out there and we missionized massive groups of people who to this day are, if you read Philip Jenkins' book, The Next Christendom, which I would recommend any of you guys interested in the demographics of Christianity.
I've read it.
Yeah, fantastic book. And he's like, look, you got to, he's not Catholic, but he's like, you got to give the Catholics credit. They have evangelized the places in the world where there's been population stability and growth. And in the future, when people think about Christians, yeah, they're going to be thinking large. They already do, right? I mean, let's just look at the coverage that the Pope just got. There's no other religious leader in the world that's going to get that kind of coverage when they're elevated to their office. Like, where else are you going to get that besides the papacy?
You think Kirill or Bartholomew will get that kind of coverage when they die?
No, definitely not by the secular media, for sure. They're like those of us that pay attention to it, that are like interested, sure, but like for the wall-to-wall coverage that you get, and like I'm not saying like that proves the Catholic Church or anything. I'm just saying that like it's evidence of the efforts that Catholics have been making for the last several centuries.
I can't remember who said this, but someone was in a spat with Luigi, and he's like, "We're an NBA playoff game. You guys are a WNBA regular season game."
That was Pine Sap. Pine Sap's a great guy. Yeah, he's got a different name now. He's got a different name on X now, but that was Pine. That was hilarious. That was a good one.
Oh, really? What's his? Or is that private?
I don't know if it's private, but I could tell you after we end, just to.
Oh, sure.
Make sure I'm not getting rid of his anonymity there for him. Pine Sap's been great to me. He's given me several shout outs that were undeserved on my parts, so I owe
a chunk of my audience. He's a good guy. Like I've been on Pine Sap's channel.
Yeah.
And I thought he did all right in the debate with Luigi.
It's just, I think these Orthodox bank the debate subjects one, Alan, that I've really been thinking about a lot recently, and the Voice of Reason one that just happened, I wasn't terribly impressed with. I think with the Orthodox, you have to get away from these these debate resolutions that constantly put Catholics on the defensive. And then two, you really need to narrow the scope down. The Voice of Reason one was whether or not the Orthodox Church is the one true church. And it's like, okay, look,
terrible.
That's good. That's good. You put him on the hot seat a little bit, but that's way too. It allowed, what's his name, Ubi. It allowed Ubi Petros to deflect the entire debate.
Yeah.
Of what about Rome? This. What about Rome? That. No, you really. I think the way that you have to do it is like the Ubi Erica Barr debate. I think that was like an ideal.
That was a really good debate. That was a really good debate. Yeah. So.
Well, I have to head out here, Alan. I appreciate you taking this time. I'm going to send this out tonight, and you guys leave your comments, leave your thoughts. I'm sure there's several different things with the Eastern Orthodox. I don't like to give too much of my attention to them on my channel for the simple fact that I don't want that to be what my channel turns into. But there's several other conversations that I think you and I could have that would be super interesting for people.
Regarding, me, I rarely talk about them on my channel. I try to avoid them on X as well, but it's kind of hard.
I've got most of them muted, honestly. Jay has me blocked, but Luigi and those guys, I'll go and see every once in a while. Like if there's like big news that breaks out, but for the most part, I don't follow these guys anymore. But I did want to present Catholics with this because, again, I think Catholics just struggle with how to answer some of these these things that are thrown at them where they just aren't familiar with the issue. So I think hopefully this gives people some perspective for, at the very least, when they're talking about one, stealing from our ranks, like you got to have some perspective about like what kind of numbers we're talking about, and two, they've got enough of their own problems to worry about in the meantime. So
as our good friend Matthew Nami has pointed out.
All right, Alan, well, I appreciate you coming on, and everyone else, God bless you, and we'll see you in the future.
Thanks for having me on. God bless.